The title of the session is really to entice you to stay throughout the full day. If I'd been a little more honest about it, it would have been a collection of things we've done well and some things we haven't done so well either, and things you may be able to learn along the way. We've heard a ton about measurement today, and everybody knows the Peter Drucker quote that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And this is really a bit of a story about how First Data, ironically called First Data, had no data about internal communications and how we began to fix that. So who we are as a company, we're one of the world's largest payment companies. We're a commerce-enabling technology company. We have 24,000 employees, and we serve 6 million merchant locations, 4,000 financial institutions, and we do business in 100 countries around the world. The scale of transactions that we do, we process about 2,800 transactions every second, and about $2.2 trillion move over our rails every year. And like many of the teams we've heard from today, the communications team that we have serving our employee population is pretty tiny. We have 3 dedicated internal communications people, 4 dedicated external communications people. And on the digital communications, that's one person on my team. I actually lead a team that supports both marketing and internal communications with technology. So like Josh, I'm more of a technology role than a communication role. But this tiny little team gelled together at a time that was really difficult for the company. In 2007, First Data had been acquired by KKR in the largest leveraged buyout in history. And it was left saddled with $20 billion in debt, and it went through a difficult time. The LBO took place right before the recession, and we had a revolving door of 7 CEOs in 7 years. It was a demoralized company, so KKR brought in a new CEO in 2014 to put the company back on track and get it ready for an IPO. And he brought in a whole new executive team, including a new head of communications, who put this function together with internal communications, external, digital, events, and video production all in one team. So as this team gelled with only a few legacy people, but a lot of legacy systems and tools, we started to take stock of what we had. And it was a whole lot of nothing. We had a SharePoint intranet. We had a homegrown email system that really didn't allow us to measure anything. And we had no idea what worked, and really not too much of an idea what didn't work either. We got some feedback about the internet being hard to use and can't find anything. And we had some strong opinions that we heard in the organization, executives who had pet projects that they liked or things that they hated, but we had no real actionable information about what we did. So as we as a new communications team came together with a brand new leadership team and really nothing, one of the first things we did was we went out and we looked for tools that we could put in place to manage what we were doing. And that's, of course, how we landed with Populo, and we also put Google Analytics in place on this old, clunky, legacy intranet that we had. So we set out to measure everything that we could, because we really had no idea what worked and what didn't. And in doing so, at the same time, we also started to get to know the new leadership team. We did a whole lot of qualitative work as we were gathering all the quantitative data in the background. We felt like we needed to establish several months of data to understand really what was happening, understand some of the seasonality about events in the company, and what worked and what didn't. So as that was going on, we started to interview and did a lot of discussions around the organization, around the world, started to put together our high-level goals, and some common elements came out of it, some of which worked and some of which didn't. I'm not sure if you can really see this graphic. You know, we thought we were aiming for one set of goals, but if you look really, really far onto the left-hand side of the picture in the distance, there's a whole different goalpost out there. That's kind of how this thing shifted over time. We looked at some of the common elements of what our leaders wanted. They wanted things that were easy to access information, easy to target employees. They wanted to enable the whole social sharing and brand ambassadorship that we talked about a little earlier. They wanted everything to be easy to access on every device. Mobility was becoming increasingly important as there were employee populations that we'd never ever reached with any of our communications except for the occasional table, tent, and flyer in a break room. And so we felt strongly about putting together a program to be able to reach those people. At the same time, we pulled a lot of folks on the ground. What do you want to do with, what do you want to get out of the emails that internal communications sends you? What do you want to do with the intranet? Number one thing that people wanted from the intranet was actually cafeteria menus. But beyond that, they really wanted the tools that they need to do their job. And so once we'd gathered all that information, we started to look around. We saw that within the analytics data for our intranet, we had enough information to start to expose desire paths on the site. And what I mean by desire paths, you've probably seen these things on university campuses and in parks and whatnot, where you've got these nicely paved paths and roads and whatnot, but that's not where people want to go. So they forge their own little dirt path that takes them where they want to be. And we found the same thing with our intranet as we started to look into the initial analytics data, where this navigation structure had been developed many, many years ago, and I don't know where it came from or how it was developed that way, but it didn't reflect what people wanted to do with the site at all. We actually found that 72% of the visits to the site were to 25 pages collectively. And in looking at what those 25 pages were, we found that they were, for the most part, those tools that people used to do their jobs. It was timesheets, it was travel booking, it was pay stubs, it was all of that utility stuff that employees go to every day. And we use that information to begin a redesign of the site to make it more useful to our employees, and employers too. We added a menu that we called Power Search. It's really a big configurable mega menu that we added to the top nav that gave one-click access to the top 20 things that people come to the site for. So we sort of shortcutted those desire paths in making it even easier for people to come to the site, to come do the things they wanted to do on the site. That also sort of crystallized two basic use cases for the intranet. One of them, the tools use case that I mentioned. The other being really what leadership wanted out of it, which was a news and information portal. We want to inform people, we want to keep them engaged, we want to tell them what's going on, and they want to get their jobs done. And we realized that those two use cases often sent us into different directions. And so as we move forward, we kept those two use cases in mind, and some of our decisions were considered maybe a little differently. We looked at the metrics differently depending on which use case we were thinking about. So for example, when you think of a metric like time on page, is a long time on page a good thing or a bad thing? For us, it really depended on the circumstance, because in the editorial content in the news, we wanted people to stay and read all our content and glean everything they could from it. But in the tools context, we wanted them to get to what they were looking for and get off and do that as quickly as possible. So we had to start to slice the data a little differently so that things could make sense in context. We also really had to rethink what some of the metrics that we were using meant and whether they were valuable metrics for us at all. So for example, when we first rolled out Google Analytics, some of our stakeholders were tracking the success of their projects using what people searched for on the site. And so we had one executive whose resource was consistently in the top 10 of most searched for terms. And they thought this was really, really great. And when we implemented the power search and redesigned some of the intranet, this resource dropped to 15 or 20 or so in the most searched for terms. And initially, they were really upset with us that we'd messed up their search results. But it turned out that we were driving double the traffic to the page and double the traffic through to the resource itself because people were finding it better through power search rather than having to use search because they couldn't understand the interface at all. And so that was one of the things that started us down the path of really using the data at our fingertips to start to rethink what the navigation should be, how the content of the site should be, how it should be organized to better facilitate the things that people really want to do. We also looked at where our traffic comes from on the site. And this, probably doesn't look too surprising, that we were really interested to see that when we segmented our engagement data by source, that the traffic that was coming from email was consistently more engaged. There were lower bounce rates, there was more pages per session, longer visits, and that was great. That meant that what we were doing with Populo and what we were doing through email was working out well. But it was kind of mysterious to us and somewhat paradoxical that the direct traffic, the traffic that people were coming straight to the intranet, was less engaged. You'd think that if people went to that site on purpose, that their intent was to go there, that they would be more engaged if something else drove them. So we started to dig into that. And we discovered that, well, I should pause at this point and say we have a launcher tool that launches the intranet at the beginning of every day. So when you start up your computer, or if your computer's on sometime early in the morning, we throw up a page with the intranet, and there it is. And the initial hypothesis, before we had any way to test this, was that if we put it up in people's faces every day, that they're going to see something interesting, and the content's going to be so compelling that they're going to read, and they're going to get absorbed with it, and they're going to learn a lot of great things. And that turned out to be mostly false, because thanks to a peculiarity of the way our launcher works and how Google Analytics works, we were able to segment the traffic that comes from that launcher versus all of the traffic of people who have it bookmarked or who type the URL in or have some other deliberate and intentional way of going to the site. And again, what we found is that on all our engagement metrics, whether it was time on page or pages per session or the amount of times that people played videos or downloaded documents or searched for things or did any sort of event, all of those people who went there intentionally with a motivation rather than because we hoped to lure them in, were consistently more engaged. We've talked a bunch of times today about too many emails. Let me tell you about too many emails. So another thing we looked at was email engagement, particularly with our newsletter that we send out to all employees. It's got a couple of internal news stories. It's got a couple of external news stories. We also send out a lot of leadership messages. We're pretty addicted to email, and we send out a lot of it. In our peak month, which was the month of our IPO in October 2015, we sent out 1.2 million emails to 24,000 employees. That's about 48 emails in a 30-day period per employee. We're not quite that bad anymore. We send about 733,000 a month, which amounts to about 30 emails per employee per 30-day period, which is still a lot. So one of the things we did just a couple of months ago, this is fairly new change, we took our email newsletter, which we were distributing 5 days a week. Every day we published an email newsletter. And we cut down the distribution from 5 days a week to 3 days a week. Not only did that take some of the burden off our team, content creation burden, because we were churning out minimum 2 news stories a day, what we saw from that is our engagement, particularly among those people who were partially engaged, those people who read 1 or 2 of the last 12 issues, increased, notably, a good 4%. A slight increase in those who read every single issue. I think we've talked a lot about email fatigue today. I'm hoping that we can continue to look for opportunities to ease fatigue and increase engagement by decreasing the volume of what we do. There's some surprises as well. And I figured at the end of the day, you need a gratuitous cat picture. One of the surprises we found is that even though our employee base is 64% in the United States, 93% of our traffic was coming from within the United States. So there's this huge disparity in how well we were serving our international employees versus our domestic employees. And as we started to look into it, we came to the realization that although the data often had a lot of answers for us, that it also raised a lot of questions more often than not. And this was one of those cases where there were some obvious reasons why we thought that traffic to our intranet was pretty poor outside the United States, because we didn't have anybody there. We didn't have a local presence. And we were able to use this data to go to our management committee, and particularly our regional executive vice presidents, and gain support for staffing up in those regions. So we were able to use this information, and now we've just hired someone in Latin America, and we are interviewing in EMEA and Latin America, in Asia-Pac. But that's not all that was going on. As we were looking into that, we also kind of looked for other reasons. Was there something else that was happening? Surely it wasn't just about lack of people. Maybe there was some other factor as well. And indeed there was. It turns out that in a lot of places around the world, you'd have to log into our intranet on every page. So every time you click to a new page, log in again. Click, log in, click, log in. So you can imagine what a great user experience that was for everybody, and how that might have affected our visits. So now that is an opportunity to raise that issue with IT and begin working on them to resolve that and improve the user experience for people around the world. That was kind of eye-opening, too, for how we could use the data we had to help with other problems. And over the course of the last year or so, there have been some questions that we've been able to answer for partners elsewhere in the organization based on the information that we have and that they don't. Now that we're able to track what's happening with employees on our intranet and through email, we have quantitative data about what some of our employees are doing, and can offer some interesting insights about those. I'm not going to go into the specifics of these, but more and more we're finding unusual uses for the data we have that help answer questions in other parts of the organization. So I started this out with a Peter Drucker quote. I figured I'd end it with a Peter Drucker quote too, because in all of this, some of our work has gone really well, and we faced a lot of challenges also. And I was 3 years ago when I started in on this, and we started to look at the prospect of being able to track what we were doing, and both through email and on our intranet. I got really excited. We're going to have data. We're going to be able to make decisions. We're going to be able to use that information to drive what we do, as well as reporting. Reporting's great, but we can use that information to be smarter about our tactics as well, and we can use that information to build out a smarter strategy. And it hasn't quite fully worked out that way, because we've had a lot of cultural issues to overcome. We faced reluctance to change habits. We've faced reluctance to actually read the reports we produce, to interpret them and use them to make different decisions in the future. So I was really inspired by the healthcare case this morning to hear that there are cases where culture is transforming with the availability of information, and that's the path that I hope to put us on as well. I think my biggest takeaway from this has been not only that The data will allow us to make smarter decisions, but in part of our strategic planning, we have to put more effort into training and into change management among our own team as well, that the team has to grow with it, that the tools themselves, of course, can't do it alone, that we collectively have to evolve as a team as we're doing it. So those are the insights I wanted to share. We've had our switchbacks along the way. I'm hoping that there's a rosier future as we continue to evolve as a company. But I was very inspired today hearing the stories that I've already heard. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk.
Glenn, if you don't mind, we'll just keep you up on stage, and we'll see
Sure.
if there's any questions from the audience. And Dave, I don't know if anyone's written in questions on the.
I don't have any on the app right
Okay.
now. But
Anybody
we'll take them from the audience?
Is anybody still awake? Have any questions? Yeah.
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
So, yeah. We had a great chance to talk prior to your session, but I'm really interested to know how. It seems like you're kind of straddling these organizations, communications and marketing and so on. How do you prioritize the requests that come into you that, maybe they're complementary, maybe they're not, maybe sometimes you see some cross purposes there?
That's a really great question. So at the moment, most of my team is really separated to either supporting the marketing organization or supporting communications. So most of my staff's time, I've got 10 people supporting web marketing efforts and social media. Like you used to do social media, I'm still saddled with it. So I've got 10 people working on that side, and I've got the one guy on internal. We do cross-train as much as possible. It really depends on priority projects. So it's really based on internal, external priorities. Some of the work that we do externally is actually for partners. So my web team creates websites for some large retailers, for example. And those types of projects always come first. When they have downtime, then they can support our internal team a little better. So there is some cross-training, but there's a complex set of interdependencies that we need to look at and really, at some point, exactly.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yep. Rich.
Hit Don't throw that one.
Don't hit him again.
Tried to kill me earlier. So talking about how you've used the data that you've generated from your channels, it sounds like you've primarily used that in order to optimize and make channels to make changes to the user experience around the channels. Have you also used that data and drawn insights from that, which you've been able to feed back into the organization that's led to any changes in strategy, or is that something that you have ambitions to do?
We're not there yet. And in terms of changing organizational strategy, I'm not sure that we'll have the depth of information to get to that point. I think what we're hoping to do in the future is a little more transformation of bringing the internal and external threads of what we do together and telling a more consistent story internally and externally, and ultimately enabling employees to be brand ambassadors, like we were talking about a little earlier, through social media and elsewhere. We're not there yet. It's a priority for the coming year, but what we've had to focus on in this first year and a half of having tools at our disposal has really been about making it easier for people to get through the day, really, and with the tools that they need to do their jobs.
Okay. Any last question? Okay, Glenn, looks like
All right.
thank you so much. That was great.
Yes.
Appreciate it.